Greetings. I welcome all and sundry to the latest video on the Non-Philistine review. I will be reviewing this absolute gem of a history book that is probably the densest, most packed book I may have ever read. I mean, this book, like the last day I was reading it, I think I spent at least 3 hours on 2 pages. I mean, the main paradox uh, of this book and of its subject, which is the Progressive Party of Canada, a political party mainly from Western Canada, but also Ontario, um, during the 1920s primarily, um, is that politics, especially federal politics in Canada, is extremely underrated in its complexity. Um, and like this is for I don't know, definitely the Justin Trudeau years, it's sort of been um glossed over by uh a complete um you know inability to even penetrate the surface of Canadian history or the factors in the Federation that are there, but there's it's like discourse was just given up on. This book is describing a period when democratic discourse provoked by a revolt in Western Canada was at a very high level. Um, it's the paradox that Canada's way more complicated than is generally assumed. And so people just don't get into the causal factors, especially the regional factors, or let alone individual provinces, well, even more so individual provinces. But this book really gets into, and the progressives, they're the ones that initiated it. A revolt, as Morton describes it, against the Uniparty, okay, the Canadian Uniparty. Now, I will define some key terms, including that one. Um, Maybe I should just define what I mean by. Oh, no, I'm going to get into that. I'm going to get into key terms. But first, I just want to draw people's attention to uh, the chapter sections on the bottom of the video. Please feel free to scroll to a section or chapter that interests you. I think I'll title the sections more based on a subject that they're talking to, not necessarily directly related to the chapters in Morton's book. But I just want to draw people's attention to that. Also, that I want to draw people's attention to the podcast tab on YouTube. That means you can listen to these videos. You don't have to, be watching the screen. So you can listen to it on handheld devices or whatever else. But and also the speed function. I have to confess that I if I watch one of my own videos, I watch it at 1.25 speed, okay? Because these history books cannot be delved into without at least 2 or 3 hours of and it's well, how long does it take to read it and write notes on it? So just consider that when it and have mercy on me for not having shorter videos. The subjects of these books are ridiculously complicated. Certainly this one. So some key terms here. No, first I'm reading the bio on Morton. This is W.L. Morton, Canadian historian of the old school. Born and educated in Manitoba, William Lewis Morton graduated from the University of Manitoba in 1932. The following year, he went to Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar and took his M.A. there in 1937. Professor Morton is the author, among many other works, Manitoba, A History, The Canadian Identity, and I will add the two monumental biography volumes of George Brown that I did videos of. So this book published 1950, but what edition is this? The book was well, this book was originally published in 1950, but I think this reprint is 1967. So it says he is currently professor of history at Trent University. So 1967. I'll also add that this copy belonged to my dad, Preston Manning, and his check marks and notes are covering the inside, of course, overlaying with my own, but you can see the habit of my dad of writing notes and check marks. He always writes. I do the same thing, but he's got his notes strewn on all over this book, and there's a sticker on the front that says the University of Alberta Bookstore. So my dad probably bought this book in the 1960s when he was at U of A. So this individual copy is seen some has a history, but more importantly, it's had a history since Morton written in 1950. I mean, this is just like the most packed full of Canadian history, like the real Canadian history that you can possibly imagine. So it was also the winner of the Governor General's Award for Academic Nonfiction in 1950. So a monumental and important work of history. So just on key terms, when you hear Morton say the phrase, quote, the party system, the progressive suspicion of, revolt against, quote, the party system, read Uniparty, okay? Read Canadian Uniparty. The Canadian Uniparty, okay? This is what the progressives had a problem with, okay? One of the main things they had a problem with. Another key term that the progressives promoted was, quote, constituency autonomy. Constituency autonomy, keep that in mind. Well, I'll define it generally here, but we'll get into the details. This is too general of a description. But basically what constituency autonomy means is the progressives' desire to keep the party brass or the party organization out of the choice of the local candidate to run. So they wanted the local constituents to choose the candidate to run for member of parliament in their riding. They did not want the party deciding that. This is the tentacles of the party system, the Canadian Uniparty, that they were revolting against. And Morton does use the word revolt here consistently. So we'll stick to terms that Morton actually uses. Okay? I'm not going to get into my own terms. Shit. The Progressive Party of Canada, published University of Toronto Press, 1950. Foreword by S.D. Clark. Who's S.D. Clark? Gotta find that out. S.D. Clark. So S.D. Clark was a sociologist. In 1938, he started teaching at the University of Toronto in the Department of Political Economy. Taught as a visiting professor at Dalhousie, Lakehead University, and the University of Edinburgh. Okay, so that's who S.D. Clark is, writing the foreword. He likens the progressive uprising of 1921 and the social credit uprising of 1935 as revolts, not movements. A stronger term than movement. Revolts of reform against the Canadian Centre. Okay, I'll leave that little teaser in there. On to the preface by Morton himself. Morton describes, quote, the great agrarian revolt of 1921 in Canada, unquote. The principal theme, Morton relates, is the formation and disintegration of a third party. Okay. His hypothesis in this book, apparently, is that, no, he says this, but it's almost like, I'll say what he says his hypothesis is, but then I'll make a comment on that. So his hypothesis in this book is apparently that parliamentary or cabinet government has strained the two-party system. Now he writes that in the preface, but it's almost like he tried to kind of cram these very Canadian a billion details into a hypothesis after the fact. That may not be the case. Maybe he started this book attempting to write a book based on that hypothesis, but because there's a problem on the face of that statement of that this is his hypothesis, that Parliament preceded the party system, like in England. So how can parliamentary or cabinet government have strained the two-party system? It's almost like he's trying to describe this incredibly, we're trying to put a hypothesis on this incredibly complicated subject, whereas he does relate quite a bit of opinion in the later chapters, characterizing the movement, giving his opinion on the movement, which is fine at the end. His conclusions, but that's they'll be in the second video. This video is only going to cover the first half, I guarantee you. But anyways, we have to relate that he says there's a hypothesis in this book, and that's what it is. So, chapter 1, we have the background of the progressive movement, 1896 to 1911. This is going to be interesting. So, chapter 1. The hopes of large Western agrarian populations giving rise to a central Canadian industrial centre thwarted by the General Depression of 1873-1896. Nevertheless, it's important to point out, this was the founding vision of Confederation. We have to remember that in all societies previous to the 20th century, the rural population made up the vast majority, like at least 80–90% of the population of any country. So the massive swath of arable land that it's on the prairie provinces um, um, was expected to have a population in the much higher than it does today. Um, so the original uh, vision of Confederation of Canada from sea to sea was a large population on the prairie provinces, uh, serviced by an industrial manufacturing sector in Quebec and Ontario. Um, of course, I'm cutting out a ton there in the role of BC and the Maritimes in Confederation, but that's it was a continental vision to Canada, not a maritime vision, which the Maritimes legitimately had fought against Joseph Howe and all that, but you can't be denied that this was the original founding vision of Confederation. So there was the Great Western Land Boom, 1896 to 1911. So this chapter is basically covering the period of the Great Western Land Boom. During these years, the two national party system reached its fullest and most solid development. I didn't know that. At no point had partisan loyalty been stronger. So that's a quote from Morton. The party system reached its fullest, the party system, quote, reached its fullest and most solid development, unquote. Oh, no, it keeps going, sorry. Quote, the party system, quote, reached its fullest and most solid development. At no time had partisan loyalty been stronger, unquote, than during the days of Laurier and Morton. I'm going to quote a letter from a Manitoba Liberal in the early 20th century that will give us an idea of this party loyalty across Canada, but even in Manitoba, but like a new province, the loyalty to your party was very strong, almost hereditary. It's described in this point. So this is in a note. Morton says, quote, a Manitoba capital L Liberal voter wrote to Laurier in 1911, quote, as a Liberal and father of 6 sons, all trained to vote Liberal, I do desire to let our rising generation see that we have not lost our time and votes, unquote. Wow! What is it? All trained to vote Liberal. All 6 of his sons. He believes he brought them up right by becoming faithful capital L Liberal voters. Wow, that's amazing. This is the strength of the party. It's almost like a family. This family votes Liberal, and this family votes Conservative, and they have for generations. All the more so in Ontario or the Maritimes, or probably Quebec too. Although Quebec's always complicated, obviously. So after 1905, the Liberals succeeded in using their platform as government to make inroads, particularly in Saskatchewan, making Saskatchewan the second pillar of liberalism, capital L liberalism, along with Quebec. Okay, so we're in another time here. There has as yet not been a third party in Canadian history, a major one. And we'll get into how Saskatchewan was initially a capital L Liberal province later. Thus, the Liberal Party had to deal with 2 radically different sectional interests within the party. the social conservatism of Quebec and the agrarian radicalism of Saskatchewan. Different time here, different time here. Morton makes an interesting, or he draws attention to an important fact that there were no parties during the territories period in Western Canada. So when Alberta and Saskatchewan were the Northwest Territories, I believe prior to 1905, you have to check that there were no parties in the territorial administration. This was Haltane's era. And there's some quotes from Haltane in this book, but he's before the period here. But it's interesting to note that he asserts there were no parties during the territories. In the territories. Is that because the executive was appointed by the federal government? Probably. I don't know. It's interesting. You could say maybe even that initial period fostered a sense of third party thinking, because there was no the initial territorial government wasn't liberal or conservative. But that's a hypothesis of my own. I'm suggesting that may not even have been the case. So another influence here that precedes this period but has echoes and from the U.S. was the capital P Populist Party in the U.S. and its failure in 1896. We'll get into how that had echoes in Canada. Yeah, so the populist sentiment in Western Canada found a home in the capital G Grain Growers Association starting in 1901. The Grain Growers Associations and the Grain Growers Guide, I believe was their newspaper, are influential throughout this period, and actually spawn other provincial associations that we will hear became the government of Alberta, but the grain grower Ansys Manitoba, and so this Grain Growers Association was, and its newspaper was the first, though it sort of started beating the populist drum in its newspaper, certainly at its conventions probably. Yeah, the annual convention of delegates of the Grain Growers Association, local branches, and after 1909, the association's organ, the Grain Growers Guide, yes. So we see already this salient trait of conventions where the local chapters get together once a year and the members, whoop it up and probably, yell about the government and pass motions determining the policy of the association. Now we can see how this might become a political instrument, but so producer and consumer cooperatives organized. This is all the same movement, all the same populist grassroots movement. We're talking about early 20th century, 1909, 1911. Premier R.P. Roblin of Manitoba, the keynote speaker at the Grain Growers Convention in Winnipeg, 1906. And he's got a thunderous speech here that I will quote. Roblin was conservative, but I think he, like capital C, conservative, I believe. But he did not disdain or did not have the he had no problem speaking to the Grain Growers Guide, which shows probably a populist culture in Manitoba amongst all the parties probably. So he says, We have in this city magnificent blocks. We have great piles, as they are sometimes described, in the form of warehouses, banking institutions, and various buildings of that kind, in which hundreds, if not thousands, are employed, and in which large sums of money are turned over from day to day. And yet I challenge any man to prove, or even assert with any degree of authority or knowledge, that any banking institution, any wholesale house, or any department store, no matter how large, ever added one new dollar to the wealth of the realm. He's making quite a statement here. It's very foundational. Continuing. But the farmer who tills the soil and sells one bushel of wheat or grows a bullock for the market adds to the wealth of the nation. Therefore, it is the sturdy husbandman of this country that we look for that development and that progress that we aspire to in making Manitoba one of the most important, if not the most important, province in Canada as far as agriculture is concerned. So it's this old debate about where money comes from, where value truly resides. I'm not going to get into that, but it looms large today just as much as 100 years ago. But he's obviously showing a populist agrarian sentiment, even the Premier of Manitoba speaking in Winnipeg. So this is the culture of the time. This is the culture of the prairie provinces. So there's affirmation here of my suspicion that, quote, the radical democracy of the old Ontario Grits, unquote, this is the old Ontario Liberal Grits, was rebirthed on the prairies. Yes, I had thought that before. I just from reading that book on George Brown and the Grits in Western Ontario, and I was pleased to see that Morton says that explicitly, so I was exonerated. He says, quote, yes, the Canadian West, quote, there the radical democracy of the old Ontario Grits experienced a new birth on a frontier less constricted and less subject to conservative influence than that of early Ontario. In their new environment, these men found their old enemies: protection, privilege, monopoly, and high finance. The ideas and prejudices they brought to the West were kept alive by the rise of the Labour Party in Great Britain, the development of the progressive movement in the United States, and the agitation of the farmers' movement itself. Never was the Canadian West more part of the world, better endowed with men of capacity, more alert to the force of ideas than in the days of the Great Immigration. So we're still at the end of the Great Western Land Boom. So the Grain Grower's Guide thunders its three main pillars. No doubt from its, the Grain Grower's Guide, that's the newspaper. It says the guide's three main pillars were, quote, faith in democracy, hatred of corporate wealth, and distrust of the political system, unquote. Wow, I would sign up to that newspaper. Tariff opposition became dominant between 1906 and 1910. Farmers had been inclined to the tariff since the introduction of the national policy in 1879. So the farmers were giving the national policy a chance anyways. But by 1906, 1910, they began to be opposed to tariffs and to the national policy. The national policy of Sir John A. Macdonald, of course, inaugurated in 1879. Laurier kept the free trade flame burning in theory. Of course, the Liberal Party was always for freedom of the individual, including in the economic realm. This is classical liberalism, real liberalism, and so was for free trade. Laurier kept the free trade flame burning in theory, declaiming on a parallel to U.S. slavery. that somehow the national policy and the tariff were like enslaving Canadians, and he makes a comparison to U.S. slavery. Merciful heavens! I'm not going to quote that because I think that's going a little far. Um, but in office, the Liberals came to tacit understanding with protected interests and fobbed off the West and the Maritimes, etc. I think I'm adding a little bit of my tweaking to this claim of Morton's, but basically he's saying that Laurier kept the free trade flame burning in theory, but he tended to um, give concessions to the financial and corporate interests despite that. So Borden held firm on the national policy during the election of 1910. In 1911, 18 Liberals, capital Liberals from Toronto, bolted to the Conservatives, led by Clifford Sifton. Laurier then proceeded to call an election, or as it was called at this time, and in Laurier, quote, went to the country. This is the phrase from Britain that was still common to Canada, meaning called an election. Okay. Yes, just a reference to Frederick Haltane. The Premier of the Northwest Territories. They call it the Premier of the chief executive during the territorial period, and when Alberta and Saskatchewan were Northwest Territories. Haltane, yes, he did not bow to the cry of loyalty that especially the Conservative Party would have always trumpeted, but Eastern Canadians, like Ontario especially, Haltane was skeptical of that claim and was more thinking about the interest of Western Canada, which may have been the first germ of a third party. So the election of 1911, free trade defeated. The Conservatives held Ontario and Manitoba. Quebec returned 25 separatists. The rest of Quebec, Alberta, and Saskatchewan went Liberal. The Maritimes and BC split between Liberals and Conservatives. So the Conservatives, Borden, stayed in power. Better dang well be right on that. I know I'm right about that. The shock of the defeat of free trade caused the rise of greater Western agrarian sentiment and a Western agrarian initial party, okay? But they hated the party system, as we will find out. So that's a party in a nominal sense. The Progressive Party is a nominal phrase. We'll find out they refuse to have a party. Anyways, R.C. Henders was the president of the Manitoba Grain Growers Association. He inveighs against Eastern, quote, aristocracy of wealth, unquote, the corporations and trusts behind the legislators at convention in Winnipeg, 1912. Yes, these conventions were great democratic whoop-ups, barn burners. The old parties suffered, after the election of 1911, a loss of influence and of trust throughout the West. Now, a major figure here, and I was going to relate key figures in the beginning here, but some of the names that we're going to be hearing in this book are Henry Wisewood of Alberta, T.A. Crerar of Manitoba, John Wesley Defoe, who I'm bringing up here, editor of the Manitoba Free Press newspaper, Mackenzie King, Arthur Mahan, quote, Borden's fixer. That's a description by John Darwin in this book. He keeps quoting John Wesley Defoe, editor of the Manitoba Free Press, and I was skeptical of Darwin giving this importance to Defoe. But after reading this book on the Progressive Party, yes, Defoe was a journalistic voice that was heeded across, well, certainly in Western Canada, but also in Ottawa, because he was buddies with, who'd he been buddies with? Crerar, but some of the Liberals and Conservatives too. I don't know. We'll get into who Defoe was partial to. But John Wesley Defoe looms large here. Now, Morton gets into Defoe. He says, Defoe wrote on the morrow of the 1911 election that corporations and moneyed interests determine the policy of Canada. And this was recognized by the majority of electors. The Laurier Liberals, not serious about implementing, quote, real capital L liberal doctrine, Defoe hammers them for. It's quite a condemnation of the Laurier Liberals. And he was glad, Defoe was glad for them to sit in opposition for 15, 20 years until they got serious, quote, without regard to the desires and feelings of the privileged classes, unquote. This is good stuff from Defoe. So we're into chapter 2. Chapter 2 that was just chapter 1, people. This is chapter 2. The Farmers' Movement and the Political Parties 1911-1918. Shockwave felt first in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta provincial politics. This is the rise of a third party, something not liberal, something not conservative. In the 1911 election, or the fallout of it, was that the Western provinces wanted free trade, and it was repudiated in the 1911 election. This caused a big rethink of the West's role in federation. So, quote, provincial democracy was simpler and speedier in its operation than federal. Yes, so the reaction to being to the 1911 election was to spawn farmers' movements in each of the provinces of the prairies to enter provincial politics. Okay. So Morton makes the more fundamental social and historical assertion that the populist agrarian political movements were part of a more basic, quote, general reform movement regarding, quote, demand for action by the state against certain evils, unquote. For example, liquor, the corruption of political life, and the lack of social welfare. This is another time, and I'll explain. The Manitoba Free Press declared on the convening of the Social Welfare Congress in Winnipeg, 1916, quote, we are at the end of an era of unchecked piratical individualism, unquote. So this reminds us that the political economic system that settled the US and Canada was laissez-faire British American capitalism, okay? It's more well known in the United States that the post-Civil War period was the age of laissez-faire, the Gilded Age. But this is also the case in Canada. This lasted until this period when in Western Canada, it's saying initially, there was some desire for to reform the excesses of laissez-faire. The Progressive Party was part of this, but how to do that? This reform movement or foundation was tied to the development of social purpose in the Protestant churches. This is the case in the United States as much as Canada, probably a little bit before Canada, but the same movement, primarily on the interior of North America. There was a vivid memory of U.S. populism, that's capital P populism. Yes, I'm going to get the dates on that, on the U.S. Populist Party and its main figures. So, the Encyclopedia Britannica, which I'll consult as a vaguely third-party voice on an American populist party, although maybe they're not very third objective. Well, we'll see here. The populist movement in the U.S. history, politically oriented coalition of agrarian reformers in the Midwest and South that advocated a wide range of economic and political legislation during the late 19th century. Yes, they were onto currency and the printing of money and strengthening local democracy. So we can see the same themes as Canadian politics. Yes. William Jennings Bryan. The subsequent defeat of capital D Democratic presidential candidate William Jennings Bryan signaled the collapse of one of the most challenging protest movements in the United States since abolitionism. Yes, so William Jennings Bryan was the capital populist champion who made it all the way to the Democratic nomination for president, but lost in the election of 1896. Yes. So there's some background on the U.S. Populist Party. Very interesting. 1896. So we will see some of these, the disgruntled U.S. populists or their ideas might have found their way up into Canada, primarily in the West. Although, as he pointed out previously, it was a combination in Western Canada of Canadian immigration from Ontario and Quebec, and the Maritimes a little bit, I suppose, immigration from Britain, and the labor movement in Britain, combined with the populist, capital P populist, immigration from the United States, especially into Alberta, that sort of combined to influence the progressive revolt in Canada. Morton relates the adoption of the Manitoba Liberal Party, 1910 to 1914, this is the Manitoba Provincial Liberal Party, of, quote, the improvement, of agricultural, quote, agricultural credits, the improvement of the conditions of labor, a good road system, women's suffrage, so Morton relates all this as planks of the Manitoba Liberal Party, 1910 to 1914, without noting the departure of this from classical liberalism. So the Liberal Party in Manitoba was at least starting to get away from classical liberalism. So I'm not saying anything's wrong with these things they're advocating, but I'm just pointing out that that's not liberalism. Liberalism is freedom of the individual. It's not group anything. It's the opposite of that. Morton portrays the Manitoba Conservative Party of Roblin as quote old school, corrupt, rough, and vicious, unquote. Had no problem, quote, organizing much of the immigrant vote. So we're in another time here. The Liberal Party, left over from the days of George Brown, and the Clear Grits in Western Ontario, was more the party of the working class in Canada. The Conservatives were, uh, left over from Sir John A. Macdonald, probably, was, you know, debonair, the old boys club, not necessarily the working class, although Sir John A. Macdonald certainly, um, you know, made inroads and had support, but in the working class. But the Liberal Party, as in Britain, was the party of the working class. So he's saying that this is still these old school party descriptions or personalities did take root in Manitoba politics, provincial politics, and federally too, probably. Whereas the Liberal Party was active in an array of progressive ideas, compulsory school attendance, this is in Manitoba still, temperance reform, agricultural credits, women's suffrage, direct legislation, that's referenda, an improved administration of justice, the improvement of the conditions of labor, a good road system. Yes, the Liberal Party in Manitoba is becoming more socially conscious, less individualistic, as would have been the case with classical liberalism. The new reforming Liberal government of Premier T.C. Norris in Manitoba in 1916 abolished bilingual teaching, so the Liberal Party is still the party of the English Canadian working class. Okay, this is the Clear Grits, rebirthed in Manitoba. The Liberal government of Premier T.C. Norris. This put it at odds with the attempt of the federal Liberal Party to win back ground lost to nationalists, that's separatists, in Quebec. Canadian politics. Oh my goodness. This is dynamics within one party. Okay. Morton portrays Saskatchewan politics as universally agrarian and reform-orientated, not complicated by the urban-rural or class division of even Manitoba, let alone Ontario. The Grain Growers Association and the Liberal government of Saskatchewan more or less one and the same. Alberta, however, started from territorial transfer in 1905, like Saskatchewan, with the Liberal government, but their similarities ended. First, the farmers' organizations couldn't speak for everyone in Alberta because of the presence of ranchers, the ranching industry, sugar beet growers, the coal miners. Second, Calgary became the center of dissent due to the endowments of the University of Alberta and rivalry with Edmonton. So Alberta did not become dominated by the Liberal Party. At this point, like Saskatchewan, that's all he's saying here, because it was more economically and socially diverse. Alberta had even fewer similarities with Manitoba, he asserts, all combining to make it maverick. Why? First, Alberta was the last frontier between 1911 and 1916 in North America. Second, it was the farthest from eastern centers, and increased freight charges and sense of grievance against Montreal bankers, etc. Third, the population during this period was 1/3 Canadian, 1/3 British, 1/3 American. All these combining clashing forces resulted in the British Ontario political tradition not taking root in Alberta. Wow, that's amazing how we're talking, just over 100 years ago, factors that determine the political culture of a province. It's just amazing. It was just over 100 years ago. In Manitoba, that political tradition, that's the British Ontario Liberal Conservative parties, was dominant. In Saskatchewan also, but it was maintained, though modified by agrarianism in Saskatchewan. So Saskatchewan's sort of a transition between Ontario, Manitoba politics and Alberta politics. It had elements of both. Alberta, however, was to shape its own political traditions and to make its own political parties. Henry Wisewood, I mentioned Henry Wisewood at the beginning, and incidentally, I attended Henry Wisewood High School in Southwest Calgary. Okay. Of course, I had no idea who Henry Wisewood was 3 years that I went there. Shamefully. So Henry Wisewood, who was Henry Wisewood? Henry Wisewood was a big deal. And I'll assert that he still is a big deal. And I'll describe and argue why. So Wisewood, quote, bearing some suggestion of Lincoln. Now, why does Morton say that? Quote, bearing some suggestion of Lincoln, unquote. Oh, I'm not going to shoot from the hip on that one. I'll let Morton back that up. The conscription issue, the Military Service Act of July 1917, quote, disrupted the National Liberal Party and freed the agrarian Western wing from the alliance with the Conservative Liberals of Quebec. So we talked about the split in the Liberal Party, the tensions initially in the Liberal Party between its two main pillars being Quebec and Saskatchewan. Saskatchewan having a larger population 100 years ago than I think it does today. So Saskatchewan had more weight in Confederation at this time. But the conscription issue during World War I, in which the Quebec Liberals were against, but the Saskatchewan Liberals were for, really split the Liberal Party. Not yet, but it's going to reduce the Liberal Party to a Quebec-dominated party. But let's see about that. Quebec's conservative Liberals, their, quote, inheritance of contractual privilege derived from capitulations and the Quebec Act, unquote. What? Quebec's conservative Liberals, that's capital L Liberals, quote, inheritance of contractual privilege derived from the capitulations and the Quebec Act. So he's saying that Quebec Liberals have a historical memory of having certain legal privileges granted to them by the British way back in 17. It was the Quebec Act. Quebec Act of 1774. He's saying this is influencing their perspective, what they think is normal, what they expect from the government. Whereas the Westerners don't think about that at all. This clashed with Ontario and Western Liberals, quote, democratic assumption of the right of majority to prevail. Holy frig, this is complicated. Hopefully this is backing up my assertion that this book is one of the densest things I've ever read. And completely just is the opposite of what has the incredibly dumbed down assumptions about Canadian politics. It's dominated by the, I won't even say dumbed down, I'll say dumb media. It's probably a large part of it. The real Canadian political dynamics are extremely complicated and interesting. The West had been moving towards independence of the old party since the defeat of free trade in 1911. It had the election of 1911 had particularly injured the prospects of the federal Conservative Party in the West, Morton asserts. Yes, the rise of the progressive revolt in a party, if you want to call it that party, obliterated the Conservatives in Western Canada just as much as the Liberals. But the progressive movement sweeping the West, while it had found a home in the Liberal provincial parties, had the effect of splitting the Liberal Party federally, due to the conservative Liberals in Quebec and the Maritimes. So, Thomas Alexander Crerar, another key figure I mentioned at the outset, had long in Manitoba, from Manitoba. He had long been a figure of power among the organized farmers. In politics, Crerar was a liberal and an agrarian, small L liberal, classical liberal, but a national, not a sectional, capital L liberal, an economic, not a class agrarian. an economic, not a class agrarian. So a classical liberal. In his economic thinking, he was a laissez-faire free trader, holding the creed of the old school of Sir Richard Cartwright and the Liberal Party before 1896. This is giving the authority of Morton to my statement earlier that the Liberal Party of Canada was originally classical liberal, not statist, not socialist. The opposite of that. Crerar tied intimately to Premier Norris and to John Wesley Defoe. 1917. What was going on then? Boys and girls. History question. Quote, war hysteria and the fundamental nationalism of the West had disrupted the orderly evolution of the farmers' movement, unquote. So World War I sort of disrupted the whole progressive agrarian movement in Western Canada. Certainly didn't stop it, though, eventually. The West voted almost all capital U Unionists. So Canadian political history, of which on this period I'm not the most informed, but after reading this book, I'm a lot more informed. Borden, moved for a capital U Unionist government, like there was in Britain, I believe, at the time, basically a war government composed of liberals and conservatives. And the West was very patriotic and voted unionist in the election of, was it 1917? Was it, or was that just on the conscription issue, maybe? No, but there was a... Yeah, so the federal election of 1917, Western Canada went all unionist. So whatever its problem with the Uniparty, it was not socialist. It was not a repudiation of nationalism, or whatever its problem with the national policy and the tariff. The West was still very patriotic. This is not a socialist movement. This is, quote, Defoe's dictum that Canada was in the war as a principle, that is a nation, not a colony, unquote. Defoe, capital L liberal, Manitoba, very patriotic. This is the Liberal Party of the old Liberal Party. So there was a, quote, civil war in the Liberal Party, but not the Conservative, because the Liberal Party had to try to balance the desire of Quebec to stay out of World War I with the strong nationalism amongst Liberals in other parts of Canada. But the Conservative, the World War I did not split the Conservative Party like it did the Liberal Party. But because the Union government was nonpartisan, the Conservative Party didn't use its provincial parties or give rise, it didn't breathe life into it. It didn't breathe life into its provincial parties because it opted to call itself Unionist. And thereafter, that is 1917 to 1930, the Federal Conservative Party weakened throughout Western Canada. Very interesting. Why don't we see conservative provincial governments in Alberta and during, if the Liberals, if they have problems with the Liberals, well, why don't they vote for the Conservative Party? Because they thought they were both the same thing. But because the provincial Liberal parties in the West were stronger than the provincial Conservative parties, 1917 to 1930, but separated from the Liberal Party due to their opposition to Laurier's pacifism. Yes, that conscription debate, 1917, was very divisive. Quote, in short, the Union government had created the conditions for the rise of an independent political movement. Chapter 3, the beginnings of political action. (1919 to 1920). This is leading up to the watershed of the election of 1921, but we will see this. The Canadian Agricultural Council set the tone in 4 provinces. Okay, so we get the grain growers of Canada, and then we've got the Canadian Agricultural Council. I don't know if it took over from the grain growers or if it's another, but it seems to have, agricultural, social and political cooperative or organization that would have had local chapters, local halls, meetings, dances, picnics, annual conventions, as we see. This turned into political parties in Western Canada. So he says the Canadian Agricultural Council sets the tone in 4 provinces. 4 provinces. I said and I included Ontario in there because we'll see why. When the tide of war in Europe turned, the Canadian Agricultural Council set to revising their policies, and its council adopted the, quote, Farmers' Platform, November 29, 1917. They were bold enough to call this, quote, the new national policy. The platform, adopted at once by the annual conventions of the 4 great provincial associations, the Grain Growers of Manitoba, the United Farmers of Alberta, the Saskatchewan Grain Growers, and the United Farmers of Ontario. This platform demanded reciprocity in natural products with the U.S., free trade, decrease in the tariff with Britain, or the tariff on Britain, and free trade with Britain within 5 years, a flat challenge reversal to the national policy of 1917. All 4 associations decided local members could nominate a candidate for Parliament pledged to the platform. Stunning resolutions, democratic culture flowering. Quote, page 64. So, this is a resolution passed by the United Farmers of Alberta Convention that This is 1919. Yeah. That Morton says was characteristic. Quote, whereas our organization has reached a state of development in freedom from partisanship, in mobilization of thought and numerical strength, that political action not only becomes possible, but is now necessary to our continued progress, and whereas the nature of this organization, the very groundwork of its development, demands that it should continue to be independent of any class or party, and free from any sectional influence, to the end that purely democratic and independent political action shall be promoted. Unquote. Democratic shot across the bow of the party system, the Uniparty. Now, were they justified in this lumping of the liberals and conservatives together? Well, we'll see. We'll see. What were the elements that they thought made them the same? We'll see. So this, yes, the provincial associations in the three prairie provinces in Ontario make this new democratic populist assertion that only the local constituents can nominate a candidate, not the party brass. Very key. Constituency autonomy, that was a key term I said at the outset. So, quote, the breach of 1917, unquote, that is referring to the breach in the Liberal Party that split the Quebec Liberals from the Ontario and Western Liberals. This groundswell, this increasing populist democratic groundswell, especially in Western Canada, would seem to have reinvigorated the Liberal Party. Yes, because the Conservatives were traditionally the old boys. Any angst against the old boys club would have, in the past, maybe seen the Liberals get elected. But Defoe stated in July 1919 that there would be a farmers' movement that neither Crerar nor anyone could control. J.A. Maharg, that's M-A-H-A-R-G, MP from Maple Creek in Saskatchewan, southwest Saskatchewan, elected in 1917 as an independent. He had to pledge top agrarian credentials. Oh wait, no, he had top agrarian credentials. In a debate on the address from the throne, he read the platform of the Canadian Agricultural Council, the capital P platform, into Hansard. Western Liberal Unionists and Conservative Unionists in Parliament united to form a nonpartisan Western, quote, caucus to advance tariff reduction, quote, the Western Unionist Caucus. So it's not a party yet. It's not the Progressive Party yet, but some Western MPs started to hang out together, call themselves a caucus, calling themselves, quote, the Western Unionist Caucus. So they're still associating with the Unionist government of Borden, but they're saying that we're different. Crerar resigned from cabinet eventually in sympathy with the farmers of the West. Yes, so I say I would have voted for the United Farmers of Ontario in 1919. There's a quote, page 71. What is the United Farmers of Ontario, which became government? It's just shocking. It's just amazing. It's a different time. The government of Ontario, let alone Western Canada. Honestly, the traditional parties are shaking their boots at this point. And once the United Farmers of Ontario won in Ontario in 1919, this was the first victory of the progressive movement, was the United Farmers of Ontario winning the provincial government of Ontario in 1919. What were their policies? Says, yes, Premier E.C. Drury, Manning Doherty, I like that name, and W.C. Good, all of whom were new leaders of the political movement in Ontario. The platform called for, this is the platform of the UFO, called for economy in government, the abolition of party patronage, the limitation of government intervention in business coupled with government aid to cooperative enterprise, equal educational opportunities for rural and urban children, good local roads rather than main highways, forest conservation, cheaper electric power, prohibition, general direct legislation, and proportional representation, unquote. Oh, oh, holy, that's an absolute revolution. And they became the government of Ontario. Quote, the Siege of Ottawa, 1973. What is the Siege of Ottawa? What happened there? The Siege of Ottawa? The Siege of... the Siege of Ottawa, 1919? See what AI has to say. I don't know what is that the Siege of Ottawa? Come on, AI, you're gonna do better than that. You dum dum. Okay. Oh, okay. So, yeah. So the Siege of Ottawa was 800 farmers from Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta who met the government and members of parliament on December 16, 1910, and demanded more equitable legislation. So that was an earlier shot across the bow, the Siege of Ottawa. That's what he's referring to there. This is serious rhetoric from the people. Drury stated explicitly in June 1919 the four farmers' associations were, quote, the nucleus of a new party. So he's thinking across Canada, as Ontarians tend to do. So there's this conception of four provinces being a block, but especially Western Ontario, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta. This is a conception which is interesting. Furthermore, he asserted there was a Uniparty. This is Premier Drury of the United Farmers of Ontario. He's probably talking federally and provincially. That was corrupted by campaign donations from private interests. The presence of the United Farmers of Ontario in the progressive movement made it more agriculture versus industry rather than just west versus east. Yes, the United Farmers of Ontario, very key part of the movement, but still mostly a Western Canadian movement. The UFO was the United Farmers of Ontario. He's like, ask. No, I won't get into that. The United Farmers of Ontario was strictly a tariff reduction, whereas the Western associations, that's the provincial agricultural associations that became the government of Ontario, of Manitoba and Alberta, had decreasing the tariff as one among several planks. So the United Farmers of Ontario was strictly tariff reduction. After the 1917 breach, the Liberal Party was dominated by Eastern Liberals, Quebec Liberals, pro-tariff and socially conservative, Quebec social conservatism. Ontario and Western Liberals were opposed. Laurier dies January 1919. This resulted in a convention, and the rallying to Laurierism pushed out the Western Liberals. This is another age. Quote, Crerar and Dr. Michael Clark, liberal, that's capital L, liberal unionist and doctrinaire free trader from Red Deer? Wow, this is definitely a different era. But we can see that the Liberal Party used to be liberal. heaven forbid, that is classically liberal for the rights of the individual, including economic freedom. Liberalism means individual liberty. Okay, not whatever these complete, morons think nowadays in the media and the Liberal Party. August 1919, the Liberal National Convention in Montreal to replace Laurier. Yes, we can see the tension hanging in the air. Mackenzie King won on the 5th ballot. And he won over reciprocity candidate. But is the opponent for reciprocity or against reciprocity? Mackenzie King would have been holding the middle ground probably, but he would have been against the tariff at this point. Just forget about it. I'll figure this out in a second. King, quote, a Laurier liberal, no connection with the West, where he was comparatively unknown. Assiniboia by-election, that's in Manitoba, showed King unacceptable in the West, with the victory of the independent candidate O.R. Gould. So after he won the Liberal leadership, there was a by-election. The Liberals lost in the West. Not a vote of confidence for King. So just a side note here is that there was some furtive party movements in the maritime provinces, but because of the relative position of agriculture in the maritime provinces, it was less. Although I don't know what happened in PEI though. But nevertheless, the progressive movement did have some stirrings in the maritime provinces. For example, it says the United Farmers of New Brunswick candidate wins big in the St. John Valley, quote, where the electorate with the immemorial conservatism of the maritime provinces had voted liberal and conservative time out of mind, unquote. There's a very insightful quote on the political culture of the maritime provinces, at least up to this point. The farmers, quote, started an eruption into politics in 1919. The Globe, the organ of George Brown, the Globe and Mail, in analyzing the United Farmers of Ontario candidates in 1919, noted most were nominated in traditionally Liberal seats. Yeah, once again, the old clear grit country. But not just Liberals. 3 sources of support. 1, discontented Liberals suspicious of French and clerical dominance. That wasn't a new theme. 2, frustrated rural conservatives, weary of losing in Liberal seats, and the doctrinaire populist agrarians themselves. Morton says conservative agrarians just as important to movement as capital L Liberals. That's capital C agrarians, just as important to movement as capital L Liberals, indeed the margin of victory. The Manitoba Free Press, always a loud voice in this period, apparently. Frankly, it's actually a voice that we need more in Canada nowadays. Where's the Manitoba, Winnipeg voice nowadays? sort of a, you know, in between the the more Western view and the Ontario view. United Farmers of Ontario wins provincial election 1919. Morton asserts the United Farmers of Ontario MPPs more responsible to their constituents, that the UFO did not act as, quote, an organized political party. Typical populist ethic, quote, 19 or page 83. What is the typical populist ethic in Canada? Quote, page 85, I should say. Many were opposed to party government and critical of the conventions by which it worked in the parliamentary system, the primacy of the leader, the discipline of caucus, the rigor of the party line. They saw both these forces controlling the Liberal and Conservative parties. Novel constitutional executive proposed. There's a whole subject. I could go for an hour on that. I'm not just. What was their novel constitutional executive proposed? I'd like to hear this. Okay, so it says that he's talking about progressives in Ontario and Alberta, I believe everybody says. Some were acquainted with a new idea suddenly published among the organized farmers at this time, the idea of an executive proportionately representative of all groups in the legislature and holding office until dismissed by a vote of non-confidence, which William Irvin had been advocating in the Alberta Nonpartisan newspaper. Okay, so an executive that's that is not beholden to party, but to all groups in the legislature proportionately. That's certainly a different conception of the prime minister. It's a nonpartisan conception of the role of the prime minister that does not even dent the current behavior of the prime minister in Canada. They're all just, they don't lose a single vote. There's no free votes. They never lose a single vote. There's not even a hint of considering themselves the prime minister of the voters in the provinces they didn't, or seats they didn't win. It's just my way or the highway these days. That's an interesting, as he says, novel constitutional executive theory. It's probably worth some further thought. Drury, chosen as leader, states in acceptance speech that he hopes not just a farmers' party, but a, quote, people's party. The Labour Party of Ontario won a few seats. This is a general revolt, you would say, against the status quo. Henry Wisewood, back in Alberta, echoed this in Alberta, calling it, quote, group government. This is Henry Wisewood's idea, one of his main ideas, this conception of economic groups in the legislatures. This is revolutionary, very interesting. We'll get into this more. Thus, labor, this would be industrial labor, would have been one group represented by the Labour Party in the legislature. This was Henry Wisewood's conception. Then there would have been a rural agricultural agrarian party with MPs or MLAs in the legislatures. representing the interests of their industry. This is Henry Wisewood's view that was trying to destroy the old boys club two-party system. Okay. The United Farmers of Ontario adopted a working alliance with the Labour Party. The Labour Party in Canada? This is really interesting. Ontario. Yes, Wisewood and the Non-Partisan League of Alberta. This was not a rival to the United Farmers of Alberta, Wood's organization, later Government of Alberta. It was purely for advocacy. This is the Non-Partisan League of Alberta. Shows you what they had their problem with. Henry Wisewood haunted by the defeat of the U.S. populists in the 1890s. Well, Henry Wisewood was an American who settled in Canada. He stood for the United Farmers of Alberta entering politics not as a third party, but as an organized economic group. Why? Because he so hated the party system evils. What are the Uniparty evils? Control from the top by professional politicians and caucus. That's one of the evils. A quote from Henry Wisewood, an article May 1919. So Henry Wisewood writes, quote, all democratic organization, as opposed to the autocratic organization of political parties, begins at the bottom and works upwards. So we had to begin at the bottom. Now, beginning at the bottom, democratically speaking, means beginning with the individuals and organizing them into local units. The UFA had already done this work in the development of the local UFA units. There was no necessity that we should organize other local units purely for political purposes. So we began to build our political organization on the local UFA units. Out of these, we proposed to build our next higher units, adaptable to the service of political purposes, which would be the district units. Solidarity must be maintained. For this reason, I would strongly advise the UFA local chapter be the only door through which admission can be had to our political organizations. This is a bottom-up, grassroots, local people organizing meetings, political culture, populism. And that's described by one of the most populist, somebody we can say is the mouthpiece of Alberta populism during this period. Certainly the ideological spokesman. He's describing the way it works. It's bottom up. For real. Nobody from the top telling them what to do. Thus, Henry Wisewood purposely restricted UFA membership to local branches and people actually farming, to retain it as an economic group, not a party. He went further than anybody in this refusal to become a political party. As such, the UFA went as far as any group. As such, the UFA ready for political action federally and provincially during the summer of 1919. Wood, in a speech at Crossfield, October 1919, expounded the theory that cooperation and competition were two basic principles, but not that he was simply against competition. Rather, he considered it a dialectic that establishes, quote, equilibrium of interests. Wow. This is political discourse, this period? I mean, okay, on the face of it, he's wanting cooperatives, agricultural, consumer, banking cooperatives, okay? So he's more partial to the cooperative principle, but he sees that he doesn't want to throw out competition completely because that would be communist. So he's actually saying he just wants an increase of the cooperative element so that a dialectic can be established between cooperation and competition that will create a, quote, equilibrium of interest. That is a stunning theory. That is unbelievable. I mean, it's, wow, is all I have to say. This is political discourse at this period. So Henry Wisewood advocated the remaking of politics as the form of economic interests or classes. He means economic classes. Or does he mean social classes? Anyways, he says economic interests or, quote, classes. That the legislature, the House of Commons or the provincial legislatures, were the places, quote, to settle class differences. Wow. This is... It's a repudiation of socialism and communism. It's saying we want to keep our democratically elected legislatures and we just want a more MPs representing the people in different industries to have a dialectic with power, with the more established urban power brokers. But it's not tear down the democratic system. This is very pivotal in the history of Canada and the United States. Why it didn't go socialist. Henry Wisewood was very pivotal in Canada to that, as was William Aberhart in Alberta, that we will see at the end of video 2. We're not even close to the 1930s yet. So Morton describes Henry Wisewood as, quote, a program of guild socialism. That's very interesting. That would bring medieval parallels to this. Not Marxian socialism, that is state control of the industries of a country. Socialism is succinctly described as, initially, was conceived as the government owning the means of production, the industries of a country. That's what socialism originally meant. But Morton says that's not what Wisewood's advocating here. He's asserting it's more of a medieval conception of guild socialism. Interesting. Wonder if people today would be interested in that. Guild socialism. Like industries having real political power as represented in the Democratic legislature. Very interesting. The Crossfield speech in the Cochrane by-election, yes, this Crossfield speech, October 1919, rings through the pages of Canadian history here, by Henry Wisewood. I think some people called him a communist, but we'll see here. James Weir, MLA for Nanton, that's in Alberta, accused Wood of, quote, Sovietism, yep, there you go, others of destroying British responsible government. The Manitoba Free Press, who has seen a transcript of this epochal speech in Crossfield, the Manitoba Free Press saw, quote, the Soviet system in Canada and, quote, class war in the Crossfield speech. In any case, by the winter of 1919-1920, organized farmers' political action guaranteed, this is in the looming federal election of 1921, a conference in Winnipeg convened under the chairmanship of Henry Wisewood. So Henry Wisewood makes an appearance at a Democratic convention in Winnipeg that shows that he's could have become a federal figure, I imagine, if he'd wanted to. But he didn't. His main enemy was the party system, was the old boys club. So does he run federally? Let's see. Henry Wisewood for occupational representation. CREER, that's the Manitoba Progressive, held for the formation of a new third party. So the progressive movement is gathering steam. Chapter 4. The progressive movement and the general election of 1920-1921. An election that Morton classifies as more of a revolt than a movement. Something stronger than a movement. Let's see. Is he right to characterize it in this strong way? Let's see. So, agrarian group caucus formed in the House of Commons February 26, 1920, led by Crerar, 11 MPs total, and constituted themselves, quote, the National Progressive Party. This is the first time we actually heard Progressive Party, but they weren't a party. They did not have a leader or a distinct party organization. Borden, so in the lead up to the 1921 election, was repudiated as the Conservative leader in December 1919. The reason was that the Union cause and Borden, as its figurehead, were doubted by this point. Just on the way out, getting old. Probably also exhausted by World War I, the Canadian population. Just like Churchill was removed from office at the end of World War II because the British people were just tired of war, tired of fighting. They certainly wouldn't have any reason to hate Churchill. So Arthur Mahan was the Minister of the Interior. He had thundered against, quote, the ramparts of gold in 1910, so he was imbibing some of the populist rhetoric. That's currency, banking. This was a major theme in the revolt against the metropolitan center, okay, both in the US and Canada. That is against the protectionism of the Laurier Liberals. But the ramparts of gold is a reference to currency reform. Arthur Mahan, a Westerner, fighting spirit who took up the standard of protectionism and replaced Borden as leader of the Conservative Party. Quote, a conservative of conservatives. A conservative of conservatives, Morton means a proponent of the traditional conservative policy, the national policy. This protectionism party stood sharply contrasted with the free trade agrarian movement in Western Canada. So Western Canada and these populist parties are not conservative except in the sense that they're not communist, but they were the death knell of the Conservative Party. So, but Mahan, far from bowing to any talk of free trade or democratic reform in Western Canada, he buckles down on the Conservative traditional policy of the national policy. The farmers' candidates lost by-elections during the summer and fall of 1920. Mahan went on the attack, signaling the drift in the Union government was over. In speeches in Quebec and New Brunswick, Mahan staked out commitment to the national policy and commitment to the national policy and to the Union government as a national government composed of all classes. This was his claim. And characterized the farmers' demands as, quote, the old Cartwright policy. That is, he's just saying it's the old Liberal Party of George Brown, free trade. He's calling them liberals, I guess. Which is interesting. They're closer to the old classical Liberal Party than the Conservatives, at least in the opinion of Mahan. But I guess they would have thought that the Liberal Party would have become the old boys club. So this whole progressive movement is sort of a repudiation of the Liberal Party, saying it's not liberal anymore. Very interesting. Oh my goodness. Okay, furthermore, Mahan tarred the farmers as a class party addicted to, quote, socialistic, Bolshevistic, and Soviet nonsense, unquote. And to, quote, freak governments and heterogeneous parliaments and experimental policies of state, unquote. Yeah, man, this is just coming out firing here. Linked them to the Vancouver and Winnipeg general strikes in 1919. Yeah, he's calling them commies, basically. And the Union government, yeah. Mackenzie King was more sly. In a tour of the West, he discreetly avoided attacking farmers' movements and hammered the conservative government of Mahan. Mahan's prime minister by this point was Morton, removed as conservative leader, or retired. The Western farmers bought neither what Mahan nor King were selling. The movement was a revolt against the Uniparty. The provincial farmers' associations accepted the leadership for the progressive movement nationally of the Honourable T.A. Crerar, who, Honourable, I guess he'd been a minister, but in the Unionist government. But I don't know, that Honourable title probably wouldn't have played too well, certainly in Alberta, but at annual conventions in 1921. So we got provincial farmers associations, the United Farmers of Alberta, the United Farmers of Manitoba. In Saskatchewan, I just can't remember the name of the Saskatchewan Provincial Agriculture Association, but there was one in Saskatchewan too. But they all endorsed Crerar. He had bolted from the Unionist government and sat as the first one, along with 11 other MPs, to sit as the Progressive Party in the House of Commons. So he was endorsed by the provincial conventions. Previous to 1919, free trade and likely agrarian proponents would have voted Liberal. Yeah, I've already said this. But as Morton explains, quote, resentment of the eastern wing of the Liberal Party in Quebec at the convention of 1919 led to a Western third party. Within the Progressive Party, two groups, this is important. The Manitoban group focused on forcing the traditional parties to reform the tariff, and the Alberta group holding radical views against the party system and desiring to replace the Liberal Conservative Old Boys Club with members sitting for industries that employed their constituents. This is revolutionary. But it's not for overthrowing the democratic system. It's for actually empowering the MP over the party leaders. Very interesting. Anybody running for the House of Commons in 2025? Listening to that? The Canadian Wheat Board, created by the federal government to guarantee farmers a minimum price. This was followed in 1917 by the Board of Grain Supervisors convened to control soaring wartime price of wheat. Premier Morton, the Liberal Premier of Saskatchewan, sensed the buzz, called a snap election. I think he sensed the buzz, that is, he was afraid that if he held off and dragged his feet on calling the election, there might be a third party formed in Saskatchewan provincial politics that would boot him from office. So he tried to nip it in the bud, and he was right. He won. His Liberal Party won, but progressives returned to the Saskatchewan legislature, and the Liberal domination of Saskatchewan henceforth tapered off. So he won another term, 3 or 4 more years, but he didn't stop the general trend in Saskatchewan. Liberals and Conservatives in Alberta, however, were both routed in provincial elections. So there's a by-election in Medicine Hat at which Henry Wise would campaign federally, not like there was a candidate there that he went and gave speeches for, won a crushing victory for the progressive candidate in Medicine Hat, 1920, 1921. There was a sense nationally that the West had repudiated the Mayan government because of this by-election in Medicine Hat. The Liberal government of Charles A. Stewart in Alberta called an election. So in Alberta, the Liberal premier's sweating in his boots and tried to do what the premier of Saskatchewan had done and call an election, but it was too late. This campaign distinguished itself for two things: populist zeal and the absorption of the Conservative vote into the United Farmers of Alberta / the Progressives. Conservatives in Alberta did not recover for generations until the I shouldn't say that, but for generations. The UFA triumphed, but awkward, as it was an open secret in Alberta that the UFA candidates didn't want power. Yeah, it's like, as a group repudiating the party system, what happens when you win the election? Let's find out. Henry Wisewood was, you'd assumed he would have been the premier, but he put into practice his hatred of the party system, of top-down party government, by nominating not himself, but Herbert Greenfield as premier, United Farmers of Alberta premier. The UFA victories in the federal by-election in Medicine Hat and provincially as government of Alberta precipitated the long-awaited federal election of 1921. So the federal Conservative and Liberal leaders are sweating in their boots, although they are probably still pretty confident that they could hold the urban centers of the East. PM Mahan opens campaign with thundering speech to 3,000 in the Grand Opera House in London, Ontario. Points his sights straight at the, quote, new party from Western Canada. This is having echoes in past other Canadian elections, like the Mulroney election, or when the Reform Party arose. This is like echoes of the. This is 1921. So the Conservative leader opens a broadside on the new party from Western Canada. There's a this is so complicated, but I should mention this. Yeah, the old Liberal Party, being classical Liberal, we actually have an MP from Red Deer, Alberta, described as a Gladstonian Liberal. Wow. But the Liberal Party, I guess they would have seen it as becoming like the Conservative Party, and so a populist movement was, gathering steam in Western Canada. This guy defected and joined the Federal Liberals, so he's probably considered a traitor in Alberta, but he was feted in the East by Mackenzie King as a sensible Westerner. But see, that wouldn't have played well in the West. There is this all Canadian parties consensus during this period. So I'm pointing out actually one thing where all the political parties, Liberals, Conservatives, and the Progressives all shared, it's just in contrast with today, on the importance of the primary industries. course, the progressives, the main one being agriculture, but the Liberal and Conservative Party would have been industrial manufacturing. They both see the the primary industries. Well, I guess the Liberal Party had that original clear grit element, so they this is something all the parties share. For example, Conservative Finance Minister Sir Henry Drayton, regarding the 1920 budget, defines the fiscal role of the federal government as, among other things, quote, to develop the natural resources of the country. Yes, there are some things that all the parties used to agree on. Certainly at the time of Confederation, that the role of the federal government was not to own the industries, but to promote the conditions for the development, that is the extraction and processing of the natural resources of the country. It's like, it's not like I live in BC, and you never hear about the forestry industry here. It's never even talked about. It's like, why? Because all they do is print money now and get people to sign mortgages. That's the industry of Canada. Not at this period. Likewise, Crerar in the 1921 campaign said, quote, our policy rests on the consideration that the wealth of Canada can be best developed or added to by developing the natural resources of the country. So he agreed with the Conservatives on this one, and the Liberals were the same. Yes, when you hear party system, read Uniparty. Henry Wisewood in Fort Macleod declared his enemy not the tariff, rather it was the party system, the Uniparty, corrupted and governed Canada. The big interests, quote, the big interests corrupted and governed Canada through their instruments, the Liberals and Conservatives. Quote, in the populist charge that the old parties were the venal agents of the big interests, again, Wisewood's phrase, both Albertan and Manitoban progressives found a basis of agreement, unquote. Yes, so we should highlight the Manitoba and Alberta progressives agreed on this main problem in Canada. Non-socialist populists. Quote, in the West, the Winnipeg strike of 1919, the leadership of which had been condemned by the Grain Growers Guide for preaching, quote, the doctrines of Bolshevism, confiscation, and rule by force, quote, had not been forgotten. So, yeah, why did Canada, or certainly Western Canada, not go communist? Because it went populist. Because I did not see these doctrines of Marxism, confiscation of private property, and rule by force as being legitimate in Canada. We did things through grassroots organization in the constituency, voting in MPs who represent your interests. This is it's a revolt, not a violent revolution. And it's ridiculously commendable. No violence. It's very democratic, civilized. This is what populism is in Canada and the U.S. too. It's too much to get in. The U.S. sometimes it has gotten violent in the past, but it never has in Canada. In lieu of class warfare, socialism. This was individual rights, small-scale private property populism, organizing itself by means of democratic conventions, where the individual members of the populist agrarian organizations voted to set policy. Yes, this is one of the main characteristics of the third-party tradition in Western Canada and in the United Farmers of Ontario as well, is the convention at which local representatives of the constituencies send delegates and they vote to determine the policies of the party, not the big wigs. This is North American populism, not socialism. You can say Canadian populism, not socialism. An extraordinary central feature of progressivism was insistence on no interference from the upper echelons of party organizations, yes, in the autonomy of local constituency nominations. I said another key term was, quote, constituency autonomy. Need more of that. Need to repeat that like a mantra nowadays. Hopefully some party is doing that. Or I should say not doing that. Letting the local people nominate their candidates, I'll just say explicitly. Quote, hence no interference with the autonomy of each electoral district, even by the acknowledged leaders of the movement, would be tolerated, unquote. Quote, the only attempt at organization was to call a convention, unquote. This is awesome. Their level of political discourse is so much higher than what is going on today. Why? Because it's dictated from the big boys at the top of the parties. And the media is just their cheerleader for the Uniparty. Actually, I shouldn't say that. I don't. I'm not quite ready to call it a Uniparty, but to the extent that both the Liberals and Conservatives, are all the Liberals, Conservatives, and NDP just just tell the local constituencies who to run, then it is a Uniparty. And tell them what to say, what the policies are. Is that going on in 2025? Is that in the upcoming election? If so, there is a Uniparty in Canada in 2025. I'm not ready to say that because I have to think about it. I have to hear what's going on, but I'm scared. This local control called constituency autonomy. Roderick Mackenzie, a founder of the Manitoba Grain Growers, declared, quote, the purport, just, saying it as they spoke in those days, the purport of the movement inaugurated by the farmers is that whenever the time comes to make a choice of representatives to Parliament, the electors get together to make this selection. Unquote. Straightforward, It's like he represents us. Period. Not the party brass. Or the big interests, as Henry Wisewood would say. We'll get into more who the big interests were, and was he right to say that? Quote, this is from Morton, these methods were the foundation, was achieved by the deliberate attempt to elect a representation which would not be made up of party-picked lawyers and professional politicians, under obligation to the suppliers of party funds. Yes, the big interests. Were they directly funding the campaigns? I think Sir Johnny MacDonald was booted from office in the, what was that, the Pacific scandal? Because he literally called like one of the railway execs and said, I need equivalent to whatever, how much money he needed to send it tomorrow, please. There's no doubt that was like, oh, we got to win this riding. Can you pump? It's just but that was laissez-faire capitalism. There's a lot more open discourse between different corporate leaders and different party leaders. But John A. even went beyond anything legitimate in that election, and he was booted unceremoniously, but he changed his ways, maybe, and won about 8 other elections after, later. But the Liberals certainly got him in that election. That was a Pacific scandal. So yes, these suspected relationships in the back rooms are still suspected even more in 1921. Mackenzie King, oh wait, yes, yes, the progressives were fully aware of the Ottawa disease. That's a term that the Reform Party used often. The Ottawa disease. What is the Ottawa disease? I should have included that in my important terms at the outset. The Ottawa disease is the tendency of MPs, no matter what province they're from. Once they get to Ottawa, they completely forget about their local constituents, and it's just this giant force of the status quo, the media, the the non-confidence club that just makes them forget anything that their local constituents sent them for. That's the Ottawa disease. Okay. Fully aware of the Ottawa disease, this is the progressives, that is the tendency of democratically elected MPs of betraying their local constituents once in Ottawa. So some progressive candidates were required. Okay, this is unbelievable, astonishing. This is this is unbelievable. So some progressive candidates were required to deposit a signed recall letter at the outset. A formal letter of resignation held at all times thereafter in the hands of the committee of the nominating convention. I'm not sure if that the local nominating committee. I mean, that's unbelievable. That is so awesome. It's like, no, we are really voting for you. Like, you are there to represent us. It's representative democracy. You don't tell us what to do. And if you don't do what we voted for you to do, you have to resign. We've got the letter already signed. That's awesome. Mackenzie King during the night, and that the progressive MPs would sign that letter. It shows that they agree with that. They consider it a responsibility once they get to the House of Commons to represent their constituents. What a strange foreign concept. Mackenzie King, during the 1921 campaign, first, as far as I know, ended the Liberals' stance as, the Liberals used to call the Conservatives the Old Boys Club. But in this election, Mackenzie King placed his party as occupying the middle between the extremes, calling them extremists, the extremes of Western Canadian populism and Tory reactionaries. This is the direction the Liberal Party went in. They were starting to have less of a problem with the Conservatives being the Old Boys Club. Did they join the Old Boys Club? They did at a certain point. But is Mackenzie King where they did this? He's starting to position the Liberal Party as holding the middle in Canadian politics. But that's not classical liberalism. It's sort of a electorally shrewd political party, not a principled party. Certainly the Liberal Party has become that. Yes, so I say the populist clear grit Liberals no more. King on the tariff tended to bend his policy depending on what part of the country he was speaking in. Led to Mann's classic jibe of the Liberal platform of 1919 being, quote, 1924. So Mann was, had his finger on the pulse there and said, well, at least I stand for the national policy. I'm not this, speaking out of 8 sides of my mouth, a liberal, which subsequent leaders, Justin Trudeau, certainly it's continued, if not increased. But is King the initiator of that in the Liberal Party? Mann hammers him. He says, yes, Mackenzie King is, and his platform is, quote, protection on apples in British Columbia, free trade in the prairie provinces and rural parts of Ontario, protection in industrial centres in Ontario, conscription in Quebec, and humbug in the Maritimes. So he was on to King doing this. Did that work? Did that make people, especially in Ontario, vote for Mann and the Conservatives? Let's see here. Yes. Yes, so King is taking the Liberal Party away from classical liberalism in one sense, in terms of, not making free trade or individual economic liberty a central plank of the party, but he retained classical liberal elements in other aspects, particularly the valuing of individual rights as a repudiation of socialism. So the Liberal Party is anti-communist still, as evidenced during the 1921 campaign by King accusing conservative recourse to orders in council, as he calls the conservatives Leninists and Trotskyists. So this shows that King was still a classical liberal, because he criticized the conservatives for being communist. I mean, this is real classical liberalism versus real conservatism. The conservatives were the ones that didn't have a problem using the government or the executive to advance the interests of the country, whereas the liberals were the ones that would care about individual rights more than advancing, a strong executive. So they would have, but King goes so far as to call the conservatives' use of orders in council as Leninist and Trotskyist. Well, he's saying it's more authoritarian than communist, but he shows that he has no love lost for Lenin and Trotsky. Because like classical liberalism is the opposite of Marxism. It's just like these morons in the Liberal Party today. It's just like they're like walking oxymorons, but they're just too ignorant. Okay. Stunning, but Mackenzie King was not. He knew, and he still was a classical liberal, although he was politically pliable. Stunning geographic and historical political sweep in this statement, page 127. So, what were the results of the 1921 election? 50 Conservatives were returned to Parliament from the native strongholds of conservatism in industrial Ontario, and from those Orange and Loyalist seats east of Toronto, which had been Conservative from Confederation and before. Other Conservative members were Rari Nantes and Gurgite Vasto. He's using Latin here. Save in ever conservative Vancouver Island in the lower St. John Valley. It's like, whoa, look at that statement. He just swept over the entire northern half of the continent in one sentence there, with an understanding of Canadian politics that is completely forgotten. What do you say, ever conservative Vancouver Island? It's capital C conservative. Sir John A. Macdonald was MP for a seat in Victoria for a while, even though he'd been there like twice. maybe once. But um, stunning geographic and historical sweep. Yes, in that statement. Quote, the independent liberal A.B. Hudson of Manitoba. This is a quote from Morton. The independent capital L liberal A.B. Hudson. It's like there are no independent capital L liberals in the Liberal caucus anymore. Justin Trudeau said, if you don't vote this way on this bill, you're not in the party. He said you can't be in the Liberal Party unless you vote. I was on abortion. He said you can't even be in the Liberal caucus, you know, let alone dare to vote on anything other than what the party wants. But nope, not in these days. I guess Mackenzie King still tolerated, you know, some independent thought. So we have the independent liberal A.B. Hudson of Manitoba, an extinct species, I add. Results of the 1921 federal election. Here we are. After all these asides, what were the results of this epochal election, this watershed? The Progressives carried the West, electing 65 MPs, including 24 seats in Ontario and one from New Brunswick. Ontario splitting three ways. Ontario Liberal Progressive. The Liberals won Quebec and the Maritimes. So freaking complicated, I can't even remember who won. The Conservative. Merciful heavens. Canadian politics. It's like, look at that list. Look at that list of the tally in 1921. Can't even tell who won. Certainly Democratic, though. Yeah, the Liberals won. Mackenzie King. The future, it was clear, might well belong to W.L. Mackenzie King if he could somehow find a foothold or better in the West and subduing the now dominant protectionist elements in his following, revive the old Laurier alliance of Quebec and the marginal elements of Canada, in a national party representative of all sections, communities, and creeds. To this he addressed his efforts when summoned to assume the prime ministership. So the 1921 election and Mackenzie King is the beginning of the Liberal Party as this cobbling together of minorities in Canada. In the past, the Liberal Party was classically liberal and stood for individual rights versus the more blatantly nationalistic, old boys club of the Conservative Party. You know, the, the Conservative Party being in favor, or having no problem with corporate power or the connection to the king and to the British Empire. But in this election, we see the Liberal Party starting to position itself as somehow a middle, cobbling together a bunch of minorities. And this is pivotal. But Mackenzie King, he didn't throw away classical liberalism completely. But this is the end of my first part of this, the densest book of history I may have ever read. And, that's saying something. I mean, like, maybe Thucydides has a little bit of more of a claim, but this book by Morton, anybody, the reason Canadian politics is not known, or Canadian political history, is because the real thing is so frigging complicated that people just don't even dent the surface. I'm talking about like politicians themselves, or let alone the media. Anyways, until part 2, au revoir.